So, Suzanne Collins is back with her fifth work in the Hunger Games series. This is Sunrise on the Reaping. And before I talk about it, a big spoiler warning for anyone who hasn't yet read this book. I will be discussing spoilers from this book. But first, let's talk about this. This is the hardcover under the sleeve, and it is just an incredibly pretty book. So definitely one with a hardcover is worth looking at getting. Okay, that's the final spoiler warning. So, Sunrise on the Reaping is about the 50th Hunger Games, the second Quarter Quell. Now, if you remember, this discusses Haymitch, who is the mentor for Katniss and Peeta in that first book. Now, if you're like me, you may remember that we already know what happens in the games that Haymitch took part in. But Sunrise on the Reaping takes this a bit further by exploring the people in Haymitch's life and how the Hunger Games affected him personally. Now, the basic plot is that Haymitch goes to the Hunger Games and has to survive. In the second Quarter Quell, there are twice as many tributes, so there are 4 from each of the districts, giving a total of 48. Now, spoiler again, we already know that he wins his games, but there are some surprises along the way. For example, given that his name isn't immediately called, it's quite an interesting moment, and it's one that kind of mystifies us. Now, one interesting thing about this Hunger Games book is that it's set 40 years after Lucy Greybeard has her Hunger Games in the 10th Hunger Games, and it seems that she's kind of been lost to history slightly, which kind of adds the mysticism around the Covey and the Baird heritage. Now, Lenore Dove, Haymitch's girlfriend, is also descended from the Bairds, which really adds to the musical themes that Suzanne Collins has used throughout her books, particularly these 2 prequels. And in doing so, it kind of adds a bit more to the world building behind Katniss's journey and her songbird nature. Now, one of Haymitch's friends is Burdock Everdeen initially, and before he starts to push people away towards the end of the book, that means that he is close to Katniss's father. He also knows Katniss's mother, which adds an element to the paternal protection he feels for her in the original trilogy. Equally, the fact that he has his own younger brother Sid parallels Katniss and her younger sister Prim. Now, there are some interesting details in this book that I feel like we may have been given before, but I don't quite recall the emphasis being on them. Now, one of these is that the Weeping Day is the 4th of July, and given Panem takes place in a fictionalised version of America, has interesting kind of connotations. A big part of this story involved many of the characters from Catching Fire. In particular, Wiress, Mags, Beetee, and Plutarch also plays a big role. It kind of sets up the fact that these characters, who are fundamental to the rebellion later in the story, have always been trying to influence the Hunger Games in whichever way they can. Now, the relationship between Beetee and his son Ambert is one of the most interesting aspects of this book. I'm really keen to reread the original trilogy to see how this prequel affects the way I see the characters from that original story. One standout scene is the way Snow is talking about the Covey and Lenore Dove, which mirrors his own feelings about Lucy Greybeard. I think there's also something interesting about the fact that we don't get Lucy Greybeard appearing herself in this story, which adds to the mysticism around the end of her novel. Now, right at the end of this book, we get an epilogue after the events of the Hunger Games trilogy, and it gives us a sneak peek into the lives of Katniss and Peeta, which is cool to see. I think it would be really interesting if Suzanne Collins was to explore life after the events of that trilogy, and I hope that if she writes a 6th book, that will be what that's about. Now, where would I rate this book? I'd give this 3.5 stars out of 5. I think it's a really well-written book, with Suzanne Collins' trademark social commentary laced throughout. However, I think the story struggles slightly, because it has to bridge the gap between an original story, like that of Lucy Greybeard, and the story that we already know of the Hunger Games, particularly since we had Haymitch's origin story briefly explained in the original trilogy. I think this story struggles to forge its own identity. In this way, it's a very, very strong book, but it's a book that can't seem to escape out of the Hunger Games shadow. One that covers characters that we already know and situations that we already know, without adding too much that hasn't already been done in the Hunger Games trilogy or the prequel. That's not to say that it isn't extremely enjoyable, and I would recommend that anyone who's interested in the Hunger Games read this book. I just think that it would be cool to see some new characters or some new events that show us something different in the Hunger Games universe. For example, it would be really cool to see what's happening further away from Panem in the rest of the worlds, if there is anything going on in the rest of the world. Or it would be interesting to see something after the events of the Hunger Games trilogy, or before the Dark Days, when the capital and the districts actually started to go to war. Still, it's an extremely enjoyable novel, and it was great to step back into the world of the Hunger Games, and I would highly recommend this book. 3.5 stars out of 5 from me. Thanks for watching.